Welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mac, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mac.
Well, hello, and welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mac. I am Dr. Mac. Today, we're going to continue our series of Women in the Bible. We will be working from the book of Judges today, and our topic will be about the unnamed woman in the Tower of Thebez and the judge of Israel, Abimelech. I put a quote around judge because there's controversy as to whether or not he was or was not a judge. So, our biblical source today is going to be coming from the book of Judges, and we have to give a little disclaimer to that one, in that, first of all, its classification has always been and continues to be controversial, and we'll mention some of that today. And we will discover that the book of Judges takes off where we left off in Joshua with his death, and it turns up 100%. The book begins with Israel's descent into moral decay, mingling with pagan tribes, going into immoral situations as it happens when people turn away from God, and even mirroring some of the behavior in Sodom and Gomorrah at one point. It is filled with atrocities. The rise of God possesses superhumans, war, and tribes turning against one another. It's an excellent read. It's a sad read, and it raises more questions to me than it answers. With reference to the woman who was in the Tower of Thebes, who takes care of usurper, despot Abimelech, we have to take a look at what was going on. She does not have a lot of verses like so many of our named as well as unnamed women in the Old Testament. But it gets to be a situation where she does something that no one else does that affords her a place in Scripture forever and ever. The women in this section of the book are faced with all kinds of atrocities, and we won't go into details regarding them, but we have rapes, we have murder, we have war, we have judges who behave very unjudge-like, we have betrayals, we have sacrifices, and we have some friends who stay friends along the way. The book of Judges is intense, and it is absolutely worth the struggle through it, the challenge of you as reader going back to ancient Israel and understanding what is going on. The contributions of this nameless woman in the Old Testament will involve us in the course of the history of Israel. The violence in the book of Judges is functional. It becomes sort of a lawless era. It's much like turning on your phone or turning on your TV today and looking at the things that are headlining the news today. The lives of women are displayed, and they are symbolic. I will say this: they're symbolic of the spiritual behavior of men at that time, as is today. Men treat women as their spirituality allows them to do that. And that also indicates that they have to become better at treating women correctly. Now, Joshua has gotten the tribes into the promised land, as we talked about last week. He has given them their allotments, but there still remains land to be claimed. They have not filled the covenant that God made with them. God has given them the land, but there's still land to be claimed. And hopefully the inhabitants of that land, the Canaanites, will become more like the Israelites. But as we go through, you will see that is not what happens. In fact, there's a term for it. They become influenced by the Canaanites. They pick up the behavior. They go back to a worship of Baal and turn away from Yahweh. And there is no Joshua and there is no Moses to remind them. They are ruled now by a set of people called judges. But let's make the correction. It is not like the judges that we have today. The judges of ancient Israel were often ranking members of the tribe. They were regional, political, or military leaders. To be honest with you, they were more like tribal chieftains, okay? Not at all like the courtroom judges that we have today. And therefore, many of them during that era, things became very disturbing and very violent. It becomes the tale of Israel's moral corruption, bad leadership, and how they became no different from the Canaanites themselves. The sad story is meant to generate hope for the future, which can be seen as is illustrated in the book's design. There's a very large introductory section that's in chapters 1 and 2 that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites like they were told to do. The large main section of the book, Judges chapters 3 through 16, has stories of the growing corruption of Israel's judges. The progression here shows how Israel's leaders went from being pretty good to okay to bad to worse and worse than worse. The concluding section, Judges 17th chapter and through 21st chapters, is really disturbing. And it shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So we want to dive a little deeper and look at that as it leads us to our unnamed woman in the Tower of Thebes. Well, who wrote the book of Judges? Well, that too is controversial. However, many Christian and Jewish traditions hold that Samuel is the author of Judges. The authorship is not explained as it was like in the book of Moses or in the book of Joshua. We have Melissa Termino who says that Judges was put together through fragmentary pieces, and it is easier for the tradition, Jewish and Christian, to proclaim the prophet Samuel as the author. Now he has namesake for First Samuel and the book of First Samuel and the book of Second Samuel, as well as First Kings and Second Kings. And he was writing during the time where things were in a mode of needing to be rescued, and they needed to have been monitored by really a legal system, but that is not how it was. So these judges included both the military and administrative authority under their sphere as well. So where are we now in our study? We are going straight through the Bible. So where are we? Well, we just said we were picking up where Joshua left off, and the people are beginning to clamor for a king. So the period of Judges begins after the death of Joshua in the early 14th century BC, and we're looking at Joshua 24, chapter 29 verse, and it continues until Saul was crowned king of Israel by the prophet Samuel in 1051 BC, and you'll find that in 1 Samuel 10 chapter 24th verse. So it acts as a sequel to the book of Joshua, but it also links the accounts after his death to where we are now. Now, geographically speaking, they are quote unquote a nation. However, they have a variety of cities and towns and battlefields that are actually still being used. You'll notice that as we go through Judges, you will find that many of the things that the Canaanites had, many of the structures, and we'll talk about the military strategy of Amalek, the watchtowers, etc., they remain, and the Israelites picked them up and they used them as weapons of war. So we try to have some inclusivity here, but there are just pieces that don't quite fit together because number one, Book of Judges is not written and presented chronologically. It is not. The final few chapters of Judges, as we said earlier, chapter 17 through 21, gives us an overview of the moral climate during the last days, rather than occurring after the period of the judges listed earlier in the book. So they probably happened in and around the reign of the different judges. And why is this book important? Well, we've already said, and one of the most important things is that it gives hope for those who are future to come in the future. The nation underwent the political and religious turmoil of the people who tried to possess parts of a land that had not yet been conquered. The tribes had started to fight among themselves, and in some cases, they were really on the verge of wiping out the Manasseh and the Benjamin tribe. Now, the fate of Benjamin is in chapters 20 and 21. This pattern of behavior in the book of Judges just talks about the rebellion that was going on, the return to adultery, and the disbelief, and then the fact that God brought judgment through foreign oppression. Then God raised up a deliverer or another judge, and the cycle repeated itself. In fact, it is often referred to in the literature as the cycle of sin. Now, ironically, in this book, we meet some heroes of faith. We already knew Othniel because we knew him. We knew Gideon, but we're going to meet some Samsons and Deborah, a first real lady of power, and we'll meet others. But then there are others who are flawed in their character, and they call upon God to deliver them after things have gotten so far out of hand. The book itself includes many of the most graphic and disturbing scenes in the whole of the scripture. Some of the names of the righteousness and others are names of those who are just plain evil. Now, the context of the book um, is interesting. The literary style is narrative. However, there is again some poetry and some discourse interwoven throughout. For me, the story is a sad story, and it is one that has to be hopeful in design. So, what is the book of Judges all about? Once again, it is the seventh book of the Old Testament. It is found right after the book of Joshua and before 1 Samuel. It is considered one of the 16 historical books of the Bible. And the author of the book, although unknown but credited to Samuel, um, is a piece that is studied because of the 325-year span of Jewish history that had gone on before. Now, what nations had the Israelites come against? Well, we know the Moabites, the Amorites, the Midianites, the Canaanites, the Philistines are going to be coming up, as well as the Mesopotamians. So the whole purpose of Judges, the book of Judges, is to show God's faithfulness to deliver his people when they turn to him. But there is more than just that of showing, but it also points out the sin and the evilness that can bring bondage into your life. It reveals the truth throughout its stories, how God can use unlikely people to bring forth amazing things when they submit themselves to God. And that's what I like about today's topic. Okay, we mentioned a moment ago about the constant cycle of disobedience and rebellion that was occurring in the book of Judges throughout all the stories. And many historians and theologians call it a cycle or a pattern of sin. And this is the way it would go. Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord and forsake him. They sin and pursue other gods. Israel goes into war and or bondage. Many times they become slaves to other nations. Israel finally hits a breaking point and cries out to the Lord. Israel turns to God and repents. God then raises up a judge to deliver his people. Israel experiences peace as they serve God for a portion of time, and it continues. It repeats itself. Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord lifts them up. Now, some of these periods of peace were as long as 40 years, and then there are others that were as short as, well, the Abimelech was as short as 3 years. Now, there's 7 things about the book of Judges. We'll just go through it. Okay. The English name for the book of Judges is a bit misleading, and we talked about that because they were not quote unquote judges in the sense they were chieftains over geographical areas. And when I say geographical areas, I'm talking about various Israelite tribes who agreed to be or who were overtaken by military leaders who were warriors, etc., etc. And the second parts of the book conflict with what is said in the book of Joshua. I look at that as having been written at various times, but if you read it, you can see that there is this overarching theme about the violent warfare and the killing of the Canaanites and the judgment and forgetting what was taught to them by Joshua and Moses. And number 3, Judge 19 tells the story of a rape. And we won't really get into that because our lady that we're talking about today is not a concubine who is with a Levite and bad things happen. When the city men come for the man, but someone in the house pushes the concubine out. Number 4, the good guys kill all the non-virgin women in the city. Interesting topic, and this again, tribe against tribe and trying to make restitution, which is number 5. The good guys facilitate kidnapping of more women who are at a festival dancing, and these are virgins there. Then God says he will no longer drive out people from Canaan or Palestine. And we know that story and how it is basically with the war, the conquest of Dan and the war with Gilbreth. And we have that story, but again, it's not part of the one that we are going to be doing today. And in conclusion, it just describes the horrible actions by the Israelites. And these actions are some of the reason God appointed a king for Israel. And that's at the closing of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. We can always begin with that quote and we can always end with it. They did what was right in their own eyes. They decided they knew better. Let's take a look at the themes that we have today. The key themes are God's grace to preserve people through their rejection of his instruction, and then Israel's desperation for God to rescue them after they go astray, and then we have Israel's descent into self-destruction. It is almost as if, once you start spiraling down, it continues. And if there's a big idea, it is this idea that these people felt they knew better and they were right in their own way of thinking. This was a habit that they had formed, but they realized when they got to the bottom or things became very bad, they needed God's grace and they needed a future king who would rescue them from their own self centeredness. Now, our male character today, Amalek, was full of self pride. Our female character today was not into self pride. It wasn't part of her thing, but with him, it was something that motivated him. Okay? So God's not going to allow sin to go unpunished. That's a primary message in the whole book of Judges today. There has to be some discipline here, and God is the one who does it. So the theological themes, and this is something we hadn't done before, but the theological themes here was the angel of the Lord. There are 59 occurrences of the angel or messenger of the Lord in the Old Testament, and 18 of those occur in the book of Judges. Mentioned very early on, the Canaanization of Israel. Instead of influencing those who were already in Canaan, they became more like, I want to do what they're doing in Canaan. It reminds me of a kid or a young adult who says, okay, they look like they're having more fun, so I'm going to go over there and do that. But it wasn't the thing that should be done at all. God's grace is one of the theological themes, and it permeates the whole book of Judges. God's relationship with Israel, a lot of patience was required here. And it's part of the history. This is where we can talk about the history. Judges, the book of Judges being a history. Um, he had given them a promise, kept it. They in turn had not. So time and time again, we see God sending deliverers to free Israel from oppression. Yet the oppressors were sent by God in response to Israel's failure to obey. Now, we take a look at Israel. Who and what was that? Remember the whole idea in the book of Joshua? They were going to go into that promised land and they were going to wish up Yahweh. This is what was supposed to be done. They would be designated a united nation per se. But Israel decided that they were going to do something that was opposite. The land, which has been in the book of Joshua, the book of Moses, going all the way back to the promise given Abraham and at the Mount Sinai, that was still an issue. The settlement of Canaan, which we've talked about. But I do want to say these three little things here. There were three models that were used for the settlement of Canaan. The first one was the conquest model, and we understand that. Okay, that's where you go in and you take it, and you sell it that way. I like to just, if I were going to write it down some way, I would put conquest model equals military force. Then we go into the immigrant model, just as the immigration issues that we're working with today. It's closely aligned to what happens in the book of Judges. It is a long and somewhat peaceful infiltration of an unoccupied area of Canaan by a variety of semi-nomadic people, and they eventually intermarry, and the indigenous members of the indigenous population, and we go into a situation where you've got a leadership battle. So if I were going to write it down, I would put immigrant model and I would put peaceful and prolonged infiltration slash intermarriage basically without the fighting, although the fighting will break out later because of the things that happen. You remember back when we talked about Moses, and intermarriage and what the problem was there and the situation with the captive women and the problem, where it had to do the shaving of the head and the cutting of the nails and okay, but that would be associated with here. The last one would be the revolt model, which rejects both the military conquest as well as the immigration model as being inadequate. So we have the small groups of slaves who escaped from Egypt with Moses, who should have understood all of this as well as those indigenous Canaanites who converted over to belief in Yahweh. Um, we have these people now who are going to revolt against the covenant religion that was established, the laws that were established for social justice, and they become as oppressive as the rulers from which they escaped. So we have those three models that we have to go up on. And then if we're still talking about um, theological themes, well, the Spirit of the Lord. And if that is easily understood in the story of Samson, but we won't talk about that right now. And then what would the judges do? Well, you had judges, and you had good judges and bad judges. You had those who remembered for a while and those who sort of decided to go with what the people wanted, sort of like the political situation we have now. One of the big topics is the women. Now, Judges is surprisingly rich in women. At least 22 women or groups of women appear during the pages of Judges. This is big for the Old Testament, and we have Sash, her story. She's considered a model, and she's actually mentioned in the first chapter of the book of Judges. But the majority of those women who participated in the passages that we're going to read about, these were persons of action or persons of dialogue. And sometimes the action was treasonous, and sometimes it was full of defeat. There was even murder mentioned in this. So the structure of the book, we've talked about it, but we'll break it down a little bit differently. Chapters 1 through 2 detail the Canaanite groups in the land, and Israel thrust into the Canaan area as well as the Canaanite gods. Chapters 3 through 16, they tell the rise and fall of the six judges. Chapters 17 through 21 detail Israel's failure to follow God's instruction and Joshua's guidance. So we we somewhat forget about the moral compromise that was made in Joshua, but there was no way they could have forgotten because prior to his death, he did his farewell speech, and then we get on into each of the judges and what they did or did not do. Well, we really want to start this discussion regarding the book of Judge Gideon, who did not want to take this on, didn't want to take on the kingship. So he's the fifth judge of Israel, and God used him to free Israel from the oppression of the Mennonites. He was given the name Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend against him. Sixth chapter, verse 32. Okay, that is Gideon. Let's take a look at Abimelech. He's the son of Gideon, whose name means my father's king. So he is also the son of a concubine. Now, Gideon did have flaws, and we talked about all of them having flaws. He had a wife, he had a harem, he had 70 sons, and he had Gideon, who was the offspring of the concubine, who was not accepted by his brothers. The sons didn't accept him. Okay, he is usually counted sometimes as the sixth king or sixth judge of Israel, although some dispute his kingship because he was totally not a godly man. We have Jotham, who is the young son of Gideon. He is the only one of the 70 sons who escaped death at the hands of Abimelech. And if you get a chance, take a look and read the fable or the parable that he has in there regarding the trees when they're asked who wants to be king. And I want you to remember that when we're talking about a fable, there's a moral, and it is the end of our discussion about the woman in the Tower of Thebes where we have the moral. His fable becomes true, and then we have God. So let's get into the women in the book a little bit more. There are supposedly 5 wise women in this particular in the particular Bible that we're working on. Now we have, and we won't go into these, but they are referred to as wise women, and they gave solutions to vexing problems. So we remember Abigail, the wife of Nabal, the dog, as it were. We remember Jael, who killed the general who had been causing problems. Um, we remember that there is, for us today, most importantly, the wise woman, the unnamed woman from Thebez, who was also in the book of Judges, who stopped Abimelech, the son of Gideon, from extending his reign over Israel, which had really been one of those um, horrible ones wherein death and destruction sort of followed him. Now, many women use their God given wisdom to make life better for their homes, their husbands, and their nations. But the five women that we were talking about were those who did more, sometimes with a great deal less. They used the wisdom they had to uproot evilness and mischievous. So in the biblical days, they were blessed women who the Lord had used, and he seeked to put them first so that they could do what needed to do. But the crafty woman of Thebes, which is found in Judges 9, has no name given, and we know when we see that unnamed woman of Thebes. So she's identified by the city, not by a husband or not by or any of that, just the city. She's not named. She's only mentioned in one of the verses, and that's Judges 9th chapter, verse 53. And then Abimelech, who's the son of Gideon, we've talked about that, had crowned himself king years before Saul was actually made king. Abimelech tried to conquer Thebes, but this woman used what was at hand um, to stop him and actually facilitated his death because Abimelech then asked another soldier to kill him, and the other man did so because Abimelech did not want to be remembered as having been killed by the hands of a woman. Um, but she did her part in saving her city, and she saved herself from a very evil man. Now, the studies that we're going to undergo here, she got involved, and it's important that we remember that she was not seeking glory for herself. She was just a godly woman who had to reach to the top uh, and have the Lord's strength, the Holy Spirit come upon her so that she could do what needed to be done to protect God's kingdom here on earth and to strive to do what would be blessed beyond measure. Now, just to say that she's a character in the Hebrew Bible is really sort of insufficient, or to say that she is the one who killed Amalek is a little bit um, understating. So he had laid siege to Thebes, and he'd entered the city. The residents had fled into the citadel, which is really just a tall tower. And many of the scholars believe that this tower is not one that was built by the Israelites, it was one that was already there. Many of the walls and structures that were there occupied by the people who were in Canaan first, they just allowed them to stay and use them. But Amalek had planned to burn this because he had just burned the tower before and he'd killed many people. He had gone into a temple and he had killed them. Fire became, along with the tower, the use of fire became part of his military strategies. But in Judges chapter 9, verse 53, then it says, a certain woman, okay, uh, threw an upper millstone upon Amalek's head and crushed his skull. Now, I like the way Herbert Locklear refers to this unnamed woman of Thebes. He calls her an obscure daughter of Israel who became the instrument of heaven to punish a sinner too bold and too wicked to live. He was really a horrible guy. We're talking about Amalek. He goes on to say, alas, there was no one to record the name and sing the praises of this heroine who must have received the gratitude of the now liberated people of the city. And the reason the mention of sing the praise, because we have the song of Deborah, and we've had others who were given high praise when they're, poetry is written about them. So let's go on talking about the unnamed woman here. This is a woman who brings death in the Old Testament, but the death that she brings is a death that is heroic in the sense. In a few minutes, we'll talk about whether or not she is a woman warrior of the Old Testament or a woman who is doing what had to be done at a given time. Now, we do have some vocabulary that we'll talk about very quickly. We've talked about the citadel or the watchtower. We've not talked too much about the millstone, but we will in just a moment. But and we've talked about the military strategy involved regarding those things that he used. Now, Amalek really wasn't in line to be anything because remember now, uh, it goes through the line of the father. It would have gone, but his mom was quote unquote a concubine, and he went to his hometown of his mom, and he talked to his relatives, his uncles. Want to be specific here, and they gave him money, 70 shekels, and he went out and rounded up what do we call them? Riffraff, sort of uses people to become members of his army. Now he went from 70 people to having enough people, quote unquote, in his army to have four different companies by the time he got to Thebes in order to try and destroy them. So in as we go through, we just know that Thebes means brightness, and that the tower or the citadel in the center of the city is where everyone had gone. Now, one of the things that perplexed me, I kept saying, asking myself, well, why was she in the tower? Well, everyone, men and women and maids and servants, and they were all in the tower. Even though they should have heard about the tower that had just been burned before, well, either 6 or 10 miles, according to whatever translation that you have. Um, uh, the only reason this tower wasn't burning is because he had to have more brushes cut, and he got really close to the tower, walking underneath the tower, which was not the thing that he should have done. But it's always referred to as a strong tower, and the tower was within the city. The tower previously was without the city, but Amalek, feeling good about himself, he walked too near the base of the tower. The woman was at the top, and you'll hear sometime about the woman in the window or the woman on the roof, but she there's nothing in scripture that says she planned it or whatever. She picked up a millstone, an upper millstone, which basically is a tool used for grounding corn or wheat, and she got the one that was small. It's not the major one, but a small one that women use in doing their domestic tasks. She got that millstone and she tossed it over the side up on his head, and it broke his skull. So, fearing the shame that he would go down in history as being this king, quote unquote, who was killed at the hands of a woman, he persuaded his armor bearer to thrust him through, and that's in Judges 9, chapter 9, verse 50. The incident is also alluded to in 2 Samuel, chapter 11, verse 21, and this is involving the story of David and Bathsheba, when the message comes from Joab, about what, and it's quoted over and over. So we have here the death of him. He's trying to cover up the death at the hands of a woman because he had not been good to women. We want to talk about abuse and all that. Emily would have been there. But you got to remember, he's coming from the concubine. He wasn't accepted as a royal member of the family. His name, my father is king. He's full of jealousy. He wants to be he wants to be a king. He wants to be a judge. And scholars disagree as to whether or not he was ever the quote unquote judge, and if so, how large was his geographical region? To those who say that it was a small one, it's hard to defend because if you can raise an army with four companies, that's a large geographical region. And he made speeches and they followed him, but they would also become disillusioned with him. They, meaning the followers, the military and the like, they were become. But the strong tower within the city is important, and it is a place if it were an epicenter, it is where we reach his demise. It's not his story. It's her story that we're focusing on. So the evil evil pursues sinners and sometimes overtakes them. We're not only at ease, the leader in villainy cannot be triumphant. Okay, so the wickedness of people cannot prosper. So God has to act, and He did through the use of this unnamed woman. He poured out His judgment on Amalek through the use of this woman. So the men and the women answered my question. The men and the women all went inside the tower, went up. Now there was if it, architecturally there was a base, but he had ordered his troops. He, meaning Amalek, had ordered his troops to um, cut more trees so that they could come, be laid against them. And they again, he was going to use fire as a means of destruction, but it didn't happen here. It did not happen. While he was waiting for that to happen, his assassination occurred. Now it's really interesting because we want to change it a little bit because we're going to talk in a moment about a biblical scholar who refers to it as a suicide, um, which I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but it's an interesting approach to this particular story. So much has been written about the tower and the fact that um, he didn't think too much because he'd been successful in one city that he could just come to another and do the same thing. But that again is sort of a haughty pride that he had formed and felt himself almost invincible. But the story is over 3,000 years old, and they are contemporaries of Amalek today. Now, we're not saying his dad, Gideon, was without fault. We're not saying that. But he reigned for 40 years. Gideon did. Amalek only reigned for 3. So his sons, he had said that Gideon had said that his sons would not rule because they had asked him, his sons or his son's sons. So he was not into that. But the one child, Amalek, was. So Gideon means the hewer, the one who hews, one who builds, and he is listed as the fifth judge, and he did good things. But Amalek is listed as the sixth judge by some. Um, but others are saying he was not, should not have been called a judge because guess what? He was not called by God. He was not called by God to be a judge. None of the scriptures never calls him a judge. He may have led Israel, but he was not a quote unquote judge in that sense of the word. And if you get a chance, go back and look at the scriptures pertaining to that, and you'll find that you can almost sense some of the things that he is doing. Now let's take a quick look at Amalek's death, okay? And it's compared to the death of suicides that happen here in the United States. Now, in the whole of the Old Testament, in the whole of the Old Testament, there's only 6 cases of suicide, okay? And the individuals who committed suicide were Amalek. Oh, I forgot about Samson and Saul's armor bearers, and there are a couple more. But today we have more than that going on. But Amalek had wars going on during his time. Uh, he wanted to he wanted to be someone he was not supposed to be. Um, he wanted to be even more influential than his family. He wanted to rule over the city, and he felt he deserved his father's legacy. And we've already talked about how he went and he got his first army going on. And then there's always this discussion, once again, of the unnamed woman in the Tower of Thebes. Um, and just that one reaction is really important. And this is why many consider this throwing of the millstone or this tossing of the millstone, whether it's a whole one used in the kitchen or a piece of a broken much larger stone, but he cracked him on the skull, meaning Abimelech, and he knew that he was going to die. And in an act of desperation, he called his armor bearer and asked him to hasten his death. Thrust me through. That should remind you of someone else. Saul did the same kind of thing. And the reason Abimelech wanted to die was because, um, as a warrior, he didn't want to go down as one who was killed by the woman. And I promise I'll try not to say that again. And the quote here, sort of paraphrase, is, "Take your sword and kill me. I don't want anyone to say," Abimelech told his armor bearer, "I don't want anyone to say a woman killed Abimelech." It's not known how Abimelech knew that it was a woman, because again, there's this absence of scripture that tells us more than we should know. But we don't know how he knew that it was the woman who threw that stone down. It's possible that he guessed correctly because the task of grinding was a domestic situation, and it was a task given by women. And you're saying, okay, McAllister, where do you get that? Go into Isaiah 47, chapter 2nd verse, and you'll see that the task of grinding the grain, whether corn or barley, was given to women. Now his armor bearer, that's Amalek's armor bearer, did as his master had asked. He delivered the final blow to Amalek and died, and he died by the hands of the attendant. Judges 9th chapter 54th verse. Now after the millstone fell on his head, Amalek realized that he was mortally wounded. What makes Amulet's suicide so unique is his great ego as a man and as a warrior. As a man and as a soldier, his ego would not allow him to die at the hands of a woman. So we don't want to get into the story of Jael and her killing with the tent peg. Now, the evaluation of it, well, we have the prophecy being fulfilled. And here again, another label to put on the book of Judges, that it's a prophetic situation, that it's a chronicle. Well, considering that it's not chronologically done, I'm questioning the use of the chronicle. But nothing is ever said to us about where he was buried. It's possible that that was an omission that involved the you know, commemoration of someone who was so evil for his nation. However, it's more probable that nothing is said about Amalek's family and his burial, because he was considered to be a wicked man who deserved his fate. Now, we have to remember, when we think in terms of him, um, did he commit suicide, or was it his armor bearer who thrust the sword at the last minute at his request? Is he the one who caused his death? Well, for our purposes, we are looking at the unknown woman as the one who um, killed Amalek. And Amalek is remembered because he died disgraceful, disgraceful death at the hands of a woman. And if you go back to 2 Samuel 21, you will see again where David is talking to him, well, did they get too close? Were you like Amalek? So he goes on. Now there are four unnamed women in the Old Testament, and we're going to talk a little bit. We're still talking about the unnamed woman at Thebez. We're going to look at her in Judges, which is where she's found, and basically the whole chapter 9, 1 through 57, because without knowing the story of Amalek, it's hard to understand where she comes into play. So he's engaged. The woman is never known. All we know is that she went into the tower. She appears, let's put it that way. She went into the tower for safety reasons. She went in to be protected. This woman's action ended the rebellion, delivered her people, and there was peace for many years after that. Now, was she shamed or unshamed? No, she's not unshamed, because her name is not given. In the Western society, we have no less than 3 names. Many cultures have even more names as identifiers. We have photos, we have holographs, we have everything. But in the Old Testament, when a woman wasn't given a name, it wasn't a dishonor. It had a lot to do with the way the the story is put together. And in this particular story, we have bits and pieces and fragments and several different people adding things on in order to try and make them complete. Intertextuality for the book of Judges is still, and will, I imagine, for years to come, being questioned. Now, is there modesty involved? Yes, because there's no mention of her family or anything other than she is from Thebes. Um, she is honored publicly for doing something that is positive for women. And the two things that make her outstanding is that she was brave when she needed to be. And second, she did quick thinking followed by an action of what would be considered that of a warrior. Now, she didn't go to battle or anything. The status of warrior is given to her because she took the initiative and she acted independently and bravely, and she solved the situation that needed to be solved. Most importantly, as far as identifiers, she's always going to be associated with Thebes and the depth of Amalek. Now, is that important? Yes, it is. So the courageous act that she did at the moment that she displayed that kind of bravery and quick thinking, that millstone, a piece of a millstone, became symbols of extraordinary courage. First of all, she climbed up the wall of the tower. Um, she was there on the edge, which is where she needed to be in order to drop it on the head of Amalek and thereby end the siege. I love the fact that the last two lines talk about, and when it was over, the men sort of came to themselves and returned to their homes. So the themes of bravery and quick thinking are associated with the woman of these. She is showcased, and rightly so, one who was full of intelligence and integrity in biblical times. I know that there are not a lot, and it would be more interesting if we had her name, but it's not given. She is, as previously stated, she is considered a woman warrior among the handful of women warriors discussed in the Bible. Amalek will go down as being someone who was evil and wicked, who should have known, but he didn't, that what he was doing because he wanted to be someone who was really special. You know, you don't kill. We have the situation where we go from stone to stone. Amalek had killed 69 of his brothers on a stone. He, in turn, was killed by a stone. So we have the stone on the stone that goes on. Again, we can go into the New Testament and we can always remember the stone of remembrance is what it's referred to by many scholars today. The feminist scholars do present her as a woman warrior, but the traditional women just say she is an unknown woman who, along with others in that tower, um, stopped a situation that could have easily gotten worse. She was an instrument of God used to save her people from death. By defeating Amalek, the woman of Thebes restored the God given rulership of judges back to Israel. A small act, but one that had lasting impact upon the history of Israel. Now, the story is an awesome story. It is, and it is hard to read, but it is important that it is also embedded in the story of Amalek, who becomes part of this theme of retribution. You know, sin equals punishment, sin equals disobedience. So Abimelech became king after murdering his kinsman, and that's in the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 6. Jotham's fable is in the 9th chapter, verses 7 through 21, and his decline is in chapters 9:22 through 57. That is the story that we have for you today. It is a topic that we wanted to talk about today. Being unnamed does not mean that you are unloved. The point that God knows who you are, knows what you are, and what you are capable of. Just as he knew that the concubine who was the mother of Abimelech, who was the concubine of Gideon, um, was was not quote unquote his wife, nor was she part of the harem, nor was it through her line that Abimelech would even have a right to the throne of Israel. If you want to take a quick look at the parable or the the speech that Jotham did regarding the trees, each one has symbolic meaning. The tree searching for a king, that was the men of Israel who wanted to have a king. And they get a king. And you're going to see what happens in our next book. The olive tree was Gideon. The fig tree was Gideon's sons. The vine was Gideon's grandsons. The thorn bush, that was Amalek. And I love the symbolism attached to him. The cedars of Lebanon, those were the leaders of Sheol. So the question is asked often about which tree and why and whatever. The point that has to be remembered is that when this was given, Jotham had come out of hiding, and he knew that. Now I'm not sure in the scripture whether he was a true follower or what, but he realized that there would have to be an end to this. And if you enjoy symbolic reading, it's important that you take a look. So we have Gideon and Amalek and the unnamed woman, and I hope you will take a look at other women and how they are treated. Now, we can always go back and we can simply say, okay, let's take a look at all of the abuse and the violence. Let's talk about the concubine, that the other unnamed woman in the book of Judges is that of the concubine. The concubine who was killed and actually as the source or part of the war. But let's just remember that this woman of thieves had something that was such mightier than a sword blade. She had a piece of stone, a stone of remembrance. It wasn't something fancy. It wasn't quote unquote one of the weapons, but it was what was needed at the time to take care of an evil person. It is what was needed at the time to take care of an evil person. What we have done with the book of Judges, we're setting the stages for what's to come. You ask God for something and you're praying for it, then you must know that when God grants it to you, you must use it as it is supposed to be used. You wanted a king, God's about to give you a king. So Emily's stories ends in verses chapter 9, verses 55 through 57, with the lesson to be drawn from his death. Okay, it has to be drawn from his death, and that lesson is we can't get so full of pride, we can't forget that God is watching over, and that He will deliver what needs to be delivered in order to save His people. The fact that He wanted to be killed and save His bride is irrelevant because if you notice, as his story is mentioned later, guess what? It is mentioned with the fact that he was killed by a woman. He was killed by a woman. Now, there are other books that have come out that are very feminist, and even though this particular character has no name, they have made her, quote unquote, the warrior for this particular story. I see her, as many of the writers saw her, as an instrument or as an obscure daughter of Israel who did what needed to be done in order to save the people. An unknown woman who sought sanctuary for herself was able to give deliverance for an entire nation. Join us next week when we go into the book of Ruth, and we're going to talk about Naomi and Boaz. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in, and we will try and answer them for you. I enjoy sharing, and I hope you enjoy listening. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a blessed day.